Hey everyone, this is Carmen, Managing Digital Editor at Ms., and I'm here with Leslie Jamison, the author of Make It Scream, Make It
Hello,
Purr.
thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you for being here.
Wonderful to be here.
And I am so excited to talk to you about this incredible collection. And I'm curious too, because I know your sort of last collection was all about empathy. And I'm always interested in an inception story. So I'm curious as to what made you go from empathy to longing and belonging, and the themes that you're exploring here.
Yeah, so I think there are some common themes probably in all my work that I'll never leave behind. Things that have to do with how people try to understand each other or connect with each other. And so empathy is one form of that, right? Like, how do we imagine other people's lives? How do we try to connect to other people's emotional experiences? But so many of the pieces in this book are about ways in which people long for forms of connection that they don't fully have, which feels like another version of that enduring, stubborn, like infinite question of just like how do we feel connected, and like what are the limits in that connection. And I also just have always been really interested in sort of surprising or strange forms of community, like ways that people start to feel connected to each other that we might not have expected. And so a lot of these pieces are coming at that question of kind of strange or unexpected community in different ways.
Yeah, and I loved that it felt like a feminist book where the feminism wasn't necessarily, laid on super thick, but there were so many feminist themes in here, whether it was, body image and eating disorders, or sort of unpacking the myth of the evil stepmother, or reckoning with, love, relationships, fatherhood, motherhood. How would you say feminism shaped this book, but just altogether, how does feminism sort of shape the work that you do?
Yeah, so when I think about how feminism moves through this book, it certainly comes to the fore in some of the essays where I'm thinking about inhabiting certain sorts of female roles, becoming a stepmother, getting pregnant, becoming a mother, but also just living in a female body and all of the baggage and all of the complexity and all of the external gazes that are like baked into the experience of living in a female body. And the last essay in the collection, which you were alluding to, The Quickening, juxtaposes two different experiences in my life that were separated by 15 years in this way that I only realized in the process of writing how deeply I wanted to have those experiences speak to each other, how much I wanted to think about them together. And one was the experience of anorexia when I was in my late teens, and the other was the experience of getting pregnant 15 years later. And on the one hand, I wanted to think about them as kind of opposite experiences, like the body getting smaller or the body getting larger. But the more I thought about them, the more I started to realize that I was living in relation to the same cultural scripts both times. So there's a moment in the essay, one of the portions of the essay about pregnancy, where I talk about getting these compliments often from strangers early in my pregnancy, saying like, you're not showing it all, or you still look so small, as if that was the ultimate compliment to a pregnant woman. You still look so small. And I think about the ways in the piece, I think about the ways that desire to be smaller, which had become tyrannical when I had an eating disorder, that script, I was still living in relation to that script, even during an experience where your body is supposed to be getting larger, that I still could sort of feel the tug of that often unspoken cultural imperative, like take up less space, let there be not so much of you, And so I think often when I think about how I come at feminist themes, it's through those moments of lived experience in which these big ideas are palpable as just like small gestures or little throwaway comments, but we see the big truths like lurking in those moments as well.
Totally. And I loved too that, this book takes us geographically sort of all over the place. And oh my God. And I loved, that even when you were traveling to faraway places or sort of examining, reporting that other people had done, writing that other folks had done, history, there was always sort of a reckoning with privilege and power. And I really loved the middle section, Longing, because I loved that there were so many essays that unpacked the ways in which, trauma and art or exploitation and beauty can really live in the same place at the same time. And it felt, the titular essay, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, really felt like such a Me Too era essay, because it was really about how do you write about a subject, how do you portray someone's life or tell someone's story in a way where you're not exploiting them or turning them into sort of, privilege porn or, glorifying real pain. And so what lessons would you say you've taken away from the essays that are in here, and what do you hope readers can take away in this current moment about that reckoning?
One of the things that came to mind first is actually really connected to something that you just spoke about so beautifully, which is the ways that multiple things and often contradictory things can live together. So like beauty and pain can live together in a work of art, like exploitation and socially valuable witnessing. Like we might think of those as completely opposed, but to me, there are works of art where we have to acknowledge that both of those things are happening at once. So one of the texts that I engage with in the title essay of the book is James Agee's 1936 book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, where he's documenting the lives of 3 white sharecropper families in Alabama during the Great Depression. And it's a controversial book and a brilliant book and a disturbing book, and it's all of those things at once. It's also, to me, a really ethically important book because he's documenting their lives, but also thinking about everything that's problematic about his documentation, that he's this Harvard-educated magazine writer from New York who has all kinds of power that these families don't have, but he's the one, it's his voice that is telling their stories. And so he's both telling their stories and meditating on all the feelings of like guilt he has about telling their stories. And does it make it a perfect work of art that he's self-aware about those things? Like, no. Does it completely absolve him that he's self-aware? Like, no, self-awareness never absolved anyone, but it does become a really important record of that like essential struggle and a really important acknowledgement of the ways that power and privilege are part of that. And so I think that idea of both as a reader and a writer accepting not only that like multiple things can be true at the same time, but that almost always multiple things are true at the same time. So that, a work of art can involve a power dynamic and be doing some work of real value or producing work of real beauty. And I think on a certain level, that acknowledgement of multiple things being true at once, or even contradictory things being true at once, to me feels like an important part of honoring my subjects when I write about them, right? To not just make somebody that I'm writing about a kind of simplified one-note piece of evidence serving some thesis statement I have about the world, right? To let my subjects be complicated, to let them be A, B, and C rather than just B or C. That feels like part of the way that I can try to grant them humanity and dignity on the page, even if I know that, you can write 1,000 pages about somebody and you're still not going to capture all of them. So what can you do? You reconcile yourself to a certain amount of incompleteness, but within that incompleteness, you try to grant them like robust life, and you try to let them be complicated and messy and all the things that are true about what it means to be alive.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes me think too about the essay in here where you go to Sri Lanka, which then also, I believe, is the same essay, or maybe it's a different one, where you're also talking about your trips to Cambodia, and you talk a lot about what it's like to sort of witness history, but the idea that if you're witnessing it without having studied it before, you're mostly ignorant to what's happening. And so are there stories in here that you hope can provide sort of an enduring lesson during this time where we're seeing, I would say, a lot of history repeat itself?
Yes, yeah. I think that's a great point. So one of the pieces that you're referring to is a piece of travel writing about a trip that I took to Sri Lanka, where the assignment for the magazine involved committing a week of your life but not knowing where you were going until 24 hours before the trip. So they bought you a ticket, they knew where you were going, but like you didn't know until they sent you an email saying, like in the case of my assignment, like you're going to Sri Lanka, which was, an exciting thing to hear, but it also kind of crystallized the way that I think people of privilege are often going into spaces that they don't know enough about, and sort of having perfectly willing to have opinions about spaces that they don't necessarily know that much about. And so in a way, you know, one of the most important pieces of advice that I've ever heard about writing, which I think is a pretty good piece of advice for like living too, is like sometimes the problem with an essay can become its subject. And I think that can play out in life. Like sometimes the thing that you're struggling with as an obstacle can become like a source of meaning or a source of learning or an instigation to kind of think harder. And in the case of that essay, the problem with the essay, the fact that I was going to this place that I didn't feel I knew enough about to kind of travel through responsibly or non-ignorantly, like that became one of the subjects of the piece, right? Is like, what are the ways in which I need to educate myself to move through this territory in a way that can actually see what's happening here? And I think about, you know, really concrete examples like I decided to go, most of the tourism industry in Sri Lanka is on the southern coast, and I decided to go north instead. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure headed north, but anyway, I found a way to the north where you really see not just like the beautiful beaches, but also like the residue of the Civil War and its aftermath, and the kind of enduring injustice that's manifest in military surveillance and the kind of signs of it that you can see everywhere. But when I was in Jaffna, which is the biggest city in the north, I visited this like beautiful gleaming white library that the town was very proud of, and the librarians were very, you know, clearly and rightly happy to be showing me around and proud of the structure. But, you know, I had done enough reading at that point to know that that library had been rebuilt from a library that was burned to the ground in an act of like horrifying ethnic violence, and in which many texts were destroyed that like there were no duplicates for, that will like never exist now. And so I was thinking about actually vision, how vision is so limited if you don't know that history, because all you're seeing is the gleaming white library and you're not seeing all the ghosts of like what was destroyed in that ground, in that place. So I think trying to cultivate, when I think about lessons, it's like trying to cultivate that deeper sight that looks at everything and says, behind or beneath this thing that I can see, there are 1,000 histories. I'm like, how can I try to see those or some of those as well?
Yeah. Well, and, you know, something else that I loved about the collection was these essays are all so disparate and they touch on such different topics. I mean, there's definitely, you know, there's these central themes, but I'm so curious as to how it was that you looked at this body of work and figured out like in what order, and sort of after telling all these stories, how did you tell the story you wanted to tell through the order of the stories, and which essays made it in, and sort of what was that process like for you too?
Yeah. So at first my idea for the structure of the book was really organized around process, that I had this idea of 3 sections, and the first section was going to include mainly these like large reported pieces, and the second section was going to be critical pieces where I was engaging with history or art or literature. So going to Sri Lanka, writing about James Agee's work, writing about the work of an outsider photographer who has been photographing the same Mexican family for 3 decades, looking at objects as a kind of critic. So I thought of myself as like a reporter, a critic, and then the third section of the book was much more personal. So I was thinking about myself as kind of an autobiographical essayist. But part of what was exciting about starting to put the book together was that I realized that in starting to sort these pieces by process, they also were starting to tell this larger story, where many of the essays in the first section are about longing for things that are far away, whether that's the ways that people long for this elusive kind of celebrity blue whale who's become known as the loneliest whale in the world. And, you know, when I was talking about strange forms of community earlier, I was thinking about these people who have become really obsessed with this blue whale. And he represents the state of being heartbroken. He represents the state of being lonely. He represents the state of being independent. He represents like Moby Dick, like whatever you want him to. But, you know, people longing for this blue whale or what they project onto him, people who build these elaborate digital lives on Second Life, and like what kinds of longings are embedded in their online existences. I look at kids who have past life memories and their families' investment in those past life memories as a way of saying, like, we're kind of longing for these lives you lived before. And that across the course of the book, I sort of move from documenting those states of longing or states of obsession with something that you can never really reach or never really touch, with a different state of being, which is to say, how do you live with things that are close at hand rather than longing for things that are far away. And so a lot of the closing essays in the collection are about becoming a stepmother, entering into more long-term domestic relationships, and like, what do those relationships involve? What does intimacy feel like up close? How does up close intimacy feel really different from longing for things that are far away? And the final section is called Dwelling, partially for that reason, that the arc of the book does sort of move from longing to dwelling, in addition to moving from this more outwardly directed gaze where I'm looking at other people, looking at the world, looking at art, to turning that same gaze to look at my own life.
Yeah, and I mean, I also just love that the stories in here are not, there's so much in here that you don't hear about in this very crowded news cycle that we have right now, where a lot of the stories are sort of all takes on the same thing and all of that. So what stories do you feel like you're compelled to tell now? What are the things you're hoping to dig into moving forward?
Yeah, first of all, I love that you said that, because I think I teach writing at the Columbia writing program, and after the 2016 election, a lot of my students who were writing essays about all kinds of things started writing essays only about one thing. I'm sure you can imagine what that one thing was: the election, Trump, and what it meant to live in the era of Trump. And while I completely identified with that impulse, and I feel it's so necessary for people to be writing about our current moment and the trash-fired administration, and I also felt like our job right now isn't to abandon all other forms of writing and all other subjects, both because I think there's no such thing as an apolitical subject. You just have to ask the right questions of your subject to find what's political inside of it. And so how can, instead of feeling like students had to refocus their gaze on our president in order to be politically relevant, I was really urging them to say, look at what you're already writing about and figure out what's already political inside of that. If you're, in the case of myself in this moment, like the big long form piece that I've been working on for about a year that I am excited to finally finish is a piece about C-sections. That's partially a personal essay, but really it's a long cultural history of the C-section and how the C-section has been understood as simultaneously, as many things at once, as a kind of an abomination and a deus ex machina, sort of man as God saving the day. But again, it's like, okay, what's political about the C-section? Everything. We can see written into the narratives of the C-section, all of these narratives about what it means to be a good woman, a good mother, and we project the tyranny of those scripts of like good motherhood onto women from the moment they give birth, and actually from much earlier than the moment they give birth. And so I think when we think about a lot of the ways in which reproductive rights are being imperiled in these horrifying ways right now, it is a lot about these same scripts of like, who's a good mother? What are her responsibilities? What sorts of like sacrifice and self-abnegation are seen as inherently virtuous, and like at what price? And so all of those questions feel at play in the particular subject of the C-section. But part of what I love about the form of the essay is you can get at these huge overarching questions that kind of apply in many different directions at once through the focus of a particular topic with boundaries around it. And you can kind of, maybe the difference between writing to the news cycle and the kind of writing the only kind of writing that I've ever been good at, which isn't usually that linked to the news cycle, is the belief that if you really dig deep into any particular thing, you find so much that like resonates beyond the contours of that particular subject. So
Totally. Well, yes. I took so much away from this that I think resonates right now with everything that's going on, because, I feel like themes of compassion and themes of rewriting cultural scripts could not obviously be more important than they are right now. So thank you. Thank you for the writing you're doing, for writing this book, for being here.
Well, thank you for engaging with it in such a thoughtful, exciting way. It's an honor to be able to talk about it with you. It's so great to be here. So,
yay. Thank you. And everyone go buy right immediately. Make it scream, make it burn. I'm here with Leslie Jamison, and I'll talk to everyone soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye.